Welcome to the Empty Teahouse. 5 small stories for a slow evening. Misty river banks at dawn and dusk. Shadows lengthen as night falls. A paper boat drifts into darkness. Listen.
Late autumn sun slants through yellow leaves as Liang and his son stand at the ferry landing. The boy, Hua, is 6 years old with round eyes and a quick smile. He chases crickets along the damp grass while Liang checks his fishing net for holes. "Father," says Hua, tugging on Liang's sleeve. "Look, old ferryman Wang has come to pick us up." Wang stands at the boat's prow, waiting patiently in his patched shirt and worn trousers. A long cane rests by his side, and he seems smaller than before. "Hurry now, boys," Wang calls out, voice gravelly with age. Liang helps Hua into the boat, then follows. As they slide off the wooden dock, water laps against wood. Silence fills the air except for the occasional splash of a fish. On deck, Wang sits by the stern and smokes his pipe, eyes distant. "Not much traffic these days," he says to no one in particular. Liang nods, looking over the murky river water where ducks paddle calmly. Hua watches the world pass them by, fields turning brown, lone trees marking distances, a scattering of houses near the horizon. His father's gaze is fixed on the far bank, and Wang steers with practiced ease. They reach the other side just as dusk sets in. Liang helps Hua out, feeling a chill bite at his neck. A narrow dirt path leads to their village, lit by flickering fireflies like tiny stars fallen from above. "Wish you could stay longer," Wang says, coughing into his sleeve. "Wouldn't mind another cup of tea." Hua runs ahead, eager for home and dinner, but Liang stops him gently with a hand on the shoulder. "Wait one moment, son," he says. Hua turns back, curious eyes wide. Liang steps to the boat's side. From his jacket pocket, he takes out a small silver fishhook, a gift from his grandfather many years ago. He offers it to Wang without speaking. Old ferryman Wang accepts it carefully, running fingers over its smooth surface as if remembering something lost long ago. "Thank you," Wang says softly. In the dim light, Liang sees moisture in his eyes, but no sign of sadness. Just gratitude. As they walk up the path together, Liang and Hua, the old man waves from the boat without shouting or calling out names. The ferryman's form shrinks until it disappears among the trees. Then comes only silence again, leaves rustling against stone walls, distant barking dogs, crickets singing their good night. Back at home, Liang sits alone in his small garden after dinner. The air is cool and fresh. Stars are beginning to appear one by one like shy eyes peeking out from behind clouds. He looks down at the worn deck of a wooden fishing boat he had made for Hua just days ago. Holding it close, he understands something without knowing how or why. That every line etched into wood tells its own story. And some stories are best left unsaid.
Somewhere across the river, a dog barked into the dark. People gathered at the ferry landing to watch the last boat of the day depart.
At dusk, people gathered at the ferry landing to watch the last boat of the day depart. A traveler stood near the water's edge, his hands clasped behind him, looking towards the mountains that rose beyond the bay. Beside him sat an old man on a folding chair, repairing nets under the flickering light of a single bulb. The traveler watched as another small craft made its way to shore from the far side of the bay. A fisherman was returning with his catch for market. The boat glided smoothly towards them, and the ferryman approached, his arms full of nets and baskets. "Evening," the old man said, nodding at the traveler. The boat drew closer, and a boy jumped out to help tie it to the dock. He was barefoot and wore only loose trousers that flapped in the wind. The fisherman leaned over, handing items to the boy who stashed them under his chair. "Got any news for me?" the ferryman asked without looking up from his task. "Not much," replied the traveler, shifting his weight on the wooden planks. "The rain will start tomorrow." The old man looked at him then, squinting against the light. I heard that too. We've got some time before it gets bad. A gust of wind blew a few leaves into the water where they swirled around and caught in ripples of the current. Did you have any luck today? The traveler asked, nodding at the fisherman's catch displayed beside them, rows of silver-sided trout laid out on a tarp for drying. Not bad, he replied. Good enough to keep me here another day. The ferryman was fixing his nets now with delicate precision, the needles and thread working in rhythmic motion under his hands. See that boat? The fisherman asked suddenly. He pointed across to the other side of the bay where a small skiff lay on the water's surface, barely visible against the darkening sky. The traveler peered but could see nothing at first. It's right there, insisted the fisherman. That tiny shadow. Ah, said the ferryman with a sigh. I think I can just make it out. The boy had been watching them all this time, listening to their conversation as he worked. Suddenly he spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you talking about? They laughed then, and for a moment the old man stopped fixing nets long enough to put an arm around the boy's shoulders. Nothing, said the ferryman, giving him a gentle squeeze. Just something we saw. The traveler stood there quietly, watching the scene in front of him play out without another word. The light had grown even dimmer by now and shadows stretched across the dock. As the last boat pulled away from shore into the gathering night, leaving only the sound of waves against the wood, the old man began to roll up his nets carefully while the boy packed away the rest of their equipment. When they were done, they stood together on the edge, watching until the boat was out of sight. Then without a word, each turned and walked in opposite directions, one towards the village market square where lamps would soon be lit for evening chatter, the other back to his house by the water's edge where he could hear the soft whispering of leaves in the trees above his roof. The traveler stood watching them go until they were lost from view, then too turned and began walking along the path that led away from the dock into the darkening village beyond.
The lantern outside the village store flickered as if testing the night air. The old ferryman shuffled onto the wooden dock with a child watching from the bank.
The old ferryman shuffled onto the wooden dock, his weathered face set in quiet lines. A child with a paper boat watched from the bank, her eyes following the ripples that spread out as he prepared to launch the small boat into the river. "Good morning," said the ferryman to no one in particular. His voice was calm and low, like the water itself. The wind had stopped blowing, and everything seemed to be holding its breath. She hesitated before stepping closer, her little paper boat clutched tightly. "Sir." "Yes." He turned his head, not stopping what he was doing. "Can I come with you? Can I ride your ferry?" He paused in his work, looking at the child. His eyes were soft and kind, but also weary from years of crossing this river. Then, with a small nod, he said, "Of course." She ran over and clambered onto the little boat, her paper creation still folded neatly in hand. He tied off loose ropes and pushed away from the dock, the water splashing slightly at the sides. The child sat quietly as they crossed the river, watching the banks draw closer together on each side. A few ducks swam by, their movements synchronized with the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. On the far bank, she looked down at her folded boat and then up at him. "Can I let it go now?" The ferryman's lips twitched upwards in a small smile. "Sure." She released it into the water where it drifted slowly away from them with each paddle stroke of the ferry. She watched as it floated downriver, disappearing around a bend. "Thank you," she said softly. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he lifted his oars out of the water and rested them gently on either side of him. The boat bobbed slightly without any motion from his hands. "What for?" His voice was as smooth as worn stone. "For showing me." She paused, then added carefully, "For showing how it goes." He looked at her again, eyes softer than before, but this time there was something deeper in them, a warmth that spoke of long days and shorter ones. With a gentle gesture, he handed her a small wooden comb from his pocket. "Here," he said simply. "You might need this." She took it, fingers closing around the smooth surface. The comb felt old yet well-tended, worn down but lovingly cared for. It fit neatly in her hand, like an extension of who she was becoming with each passing moment. He watched her hold it, the way her eyes moved over its grain and texture before looking back up at him again. Then he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something they both understood without speaking about it further. The ferryman started moving towards the bank once more. As he did so, she opened his comb case and ran a hand through her hair, softly, thoughtfully, and then tucked the object away in her pocket with careful deliberation. On reaching shore, she stepped off into the grassy verge beside him where daisies waved slightly under the morning sun's weak rays. Without another word, she walked back towards town, holding tightly to something intangible but deeply felt within herself. The ferryman watched until she was out of sight before turning his gaze downriver. With a slow nod to himself, he began preparing for his next crossing, readying the ropes and checking that everything was in order as always. His hands moved with practiced ease, each action speaking volumes about days filled with quiet purpose. As dusk fell later that day, a gentle breeze stirred through the grasses near the riverbank where he often sat after work. The ferryman looked out over the water at the fading light and saw something drifting downstream, a small paper boat reflecting the last rays of sunlight.
Somewhere downstream, the paper boat caught the last light, glinting briefly like a tiny lantern. At dusk, Li Hua returned to the village where he had grown up.
At dusk, Li Hua returned to the village where he had grown up. The air was cool and carried a hint of autumn. He walked through narrow streets he once knew by heart, past the temple where he used to run with friends, and down towards the riverbank. The water glinted softly under the last light of day. There, Li Hua saw an old woman sitting on the bank. She had pulled up a small fishing boat and was leaning over it, cleaning her catch. He approached slowly, his steps soft against the dirt path. She looked up as he neared, her face wrinkled with age but still bright with clarity. "Hello," Li Hua said quietly. "I didn't expect to see anyone here." The old woman smiled and nodded at him without speaking. Her movements were slow and deliberate as she dried a fish in the fading light. Li Hua sat down beside her, looking across the river where fields stretched towards the horizon. A breeze stirred the water, creating small ripples that caught the last rays of sunlight. After some time, Li Hua asked, "Are you waiting for someone?" The old woman shook her head and then pointed at a tree growing near the edge of the bank. Its leaves were turning red and orange in the chill air. A bird had perched there, its beak open as if singing to itself. Li Hua watched it for a moment before saying, "It's been years since I've come back here. The world seems different now." She glanced at him briefly but returned her attention to her work. "Do you remember when we were young?" Li Hua continued after a pause, "and would race the fish from pond to pond?" The old woman laughed softly and nodded, her eyes crinkling with fondness. He smiled too, remembering days when time moved differently. Then he said, "I left not long after that. I wanted more than just this village." She finished drying another fish and put it into a basket. Li Hua noticed she had many clean ones lined up beside the boat. "You brought your own back with you," he noted. "Yes," she replied simply. Li Hua looked at her hand, rough but capable, as she cleaned one last fish. The sun was nearly gone now, leaving only deepening shadows and stars appearing in the night sky above them. As if sensing his thoughts drift inward, the old woman said, "Sometimes we leave to find what's missing inside us." Li Hua nodded slowly, understanding her words without needing to explain further. "Others come back to see what's changed," she added quietly, setting down the knife and looking out over the river. but more stays the same than goes away. He thought about his childhood friend who had stayed here all these years, planting trees and tending a garden. Then he thought of his own wanderings and distant memories. A breeze fluttered through the leaves overhead. The old woman stood up then and started walking back towards her home along the path they'd come from. Li Hua followed without speaking. They walked in silence until she stopped at her door, turned to him once more, and said simply, "Thank you for talking." Li Hua nodded his thanks. She smiled warmly before stepping inside. He continued on alone, a few leaves skittering across the path ahead of him.
A single star blinked twice, then faded into night. Late afternoon light filtered through the leaves of a dense bamboo grove.
Late afternoon light filtered through the leaves of a dense bamboo grove, casting intricate shadows on the ground. In the quiet space between two clumps of stalks stood a young woman, her eyes tracing the path before her with a sense of purpose she couldn't quite place. Her name was May, and she carried a small basket slung over one shoulder. A few steps away from the grove's entrance, where sunlight met shadow, an older man sat on a rock. He wore simple clothes that had seen many seasons, dark trousers and a loose shirt with worn patches at the elbows. His hair was graying at the temples, and there was something serene in his posture as he gazed at the trees. May paused when she saw him. There was no noise to disturb the moment's calm except for the soft murmur of rainwater trickling through the bamboo. She approached slowly, placing her basket beside the rock where he sat. "May I join you?" May asked softly, not looking directly at him but rather letting her gaze rest on the grove around them. The man nodded without turning his head and said, "Of course." May settled herself next to him, feeling the cool stone beneath. She felt a small tug of relief in this quiet companionship. "I came here hoping to find someone who could teach me how to cut bamboo," May explained after an initial silence. "I want to make some new blinds for my home." Her voice was even and calm, as if speaking to herself. The man turned his head slightly toward her but kept the rest of himself still. "Why that?" he asked gently, his tone curious rather than critical. "I don't know," May replied honestly. "Perhaps it's because I admire how you can make something useful from such a simple plant." She tilted her head to look at him directly for the first time, catching a hint of a smile playing around his lips. The man reached into his own basket and pulled out an old bamboo knife. Its blade was worn but clean, as if it had been lovingly tended over years of use. He handed it to May without speaking, then took her hand and placed hers over the grip. May's fingers wrapped around the handle instinctively. She felt the weight of the tool, its familiar contours fitting snugly against her palm. "Thank you," she said, turning the knife in her hands. They sat there for a long while, neither feeling the need to speak or move. May's eyes wandered from the grove to her lap and back again, eventually coming to rest on the small blade now lying between them. The man leaned forward slightly, taking up the knife himself and placing it precisely against a stalk of bamboo nearby. With swift precision, he carved an incision along its length, revealing the green pulp beneath. When he stepped back, May understood what she needed to know without him explaining it in words. She picked up the blade again and approached the nearest stalk with her own tentative strokes. Her movements were clumsy at first, but gradually she found a rhythm as they worked side by side. Hours passed uncounted as day bled into evening. The sound of slicing bamboo filled their airless world, the rhythmic noise mingling with distant birdsong and falling leaves. Neither spoke about what was happening or would happen next. Instead, each simply continued to cut in silence until the last of the light had faded. May stepped back from her final work, examining it closely. She saw no flaws, only beauty and strength. Satisfied, She turned to thank him once more but found that he had already gone, leaving behind a faint impression of his presence as if he'd never been there at all. As night fell, May packed up her tools and began the short journey back to her home. In the darkening grove, a single note struck on an invisible breeze, a gentle rustle from one of the cut stalks, swaying lightly in place.
The lantern flame swayed once, then steadied again, holding quiet company in the gathering darkness. The kettle cools at the empty tea house. Until tomorrow.